I almost felt like I was ready to be checked in somewhere because it was that bad. Like, I just could not do this, and I needed to go somewhere where I wasn't gonna do this. Like, I was gonna run away or something because I didn't see a way out.
Are you pregnant or a new parent looking to ensure a better postpartum experience? Or are you a birth worker looking to improve your postpartum care skills? Check out Thriving After Birth, an online self-paced course by me, midwife and educator Tanya Tringali. It's 10 and a half hours of video content featuring experts in lactation, mental health, pelvic floor health, pediatric sleep issues. You also get worksheets and a workbook, as well as options to have a one-on-one session with me. Sign up at motherwitmaternity.com/thriving, and let's improve postpartum care together. Hey everyone, I'm your midwife, Tanya Tringali. Welcome to the Mother Wit Podcast, a show about the issues we, healthcare consumers and providers, face every day as we interact with the medical system. We'll talk about its blind spots, shortcomings, and share strategies we can use to feel seen and heard, no matter which side of the table we sit on. On today's episode, I have one of the most honest stories any new parent has ever told on this show. If you've been listening for a while, you know that each season I feature clients who are willing to share. I invite people with all sorts of varied experiences and perspectives, but I do try to shine a light on topics for which I think people need more information. Topics that I think people can learn about best by hearing personal stories. So today, Patti, a client who stands out in my mind as one of the people who struggled the most with a history of depression and anxiety before, during, and after her pregnancy, graciously shares her story. At times, I worried that I wouldn't know how best to help her, but she worked so hard and she was so willing to try almost anything I suggested. I found that to be such a unique quality because, as you know, anxiety and depression can be debilitating, but she was rather persistent in her pursuit of happiness. Patti, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for inviting me.
I really think that your story is going to resonate with so many people who feel so much of what you felt, have a similar, even previous to pregnancy, lived experience, and kind of just keep all that inside and deal with a lot of it alone. It's still hard for me to believe that that's as common as it is, but it is. It's really common for people to feel like they have no one to go to in these situations.
Absolutely. I remember thinking, that there's a statistic of 1 in 7 people have postpartum depression. And yet going into this, I only knew of one person personally that I knew who had gone through it, which is obviously not the case. Obviously lots of more people that I know have gone through it and just don't talk about it. And I feel like that's such a shame because when I started to open up about it, I did hear from people like, oh yeah, I went through that too, but it would have been nice to know that ahead of time, because then I could have had more support going into it, knowing that others had gone through the same thing that I could turn to who would get it,
Yeah, I feel like depression, anxiety, mood disorders in general are similar in our current cultural point in history, I suppose, as miscarriage. Right? Like miscarriage isn't talked about enough. So when somebody has a miscarriage, they feel really alone. And only after they've had a miscarriage and they try to talk to people, do all these others come out of the woodwork and say, oh, I've had that experience too. So it's so interesting. And I see a shift culturally. We are doing a little bit better, but by no means are we in a good place.
Yeah. And I've tried to be really open about it too, but I see why it's difficult to talk about it because it's not, you're kind of protecting yourself in a way too, from judgment or from people just not understanding and saying something that will make it worse, right? Yeah. So, that happens a lot. I'll open up to someone and, it's also so different how my friendships have changed since having kids. Like, I must have been like such a bad friend before because I didn't understand, I didn't understand how to support my friends who had kids at all until I had one and I was in it. And then all these new moms that I had been friends with just came out of nowhere and just supported me so much, which was so helpful, because you really need that. And so it can be tough to know where to get support from.
Yeah.
And that's also why I was really glad that I tried to have as many systems in place at a time, like you especially, because I don't know how I would have survived otherwise. I did anticipate it being rough for me, but I couldn't have imagined how bad it was gonna be until I was in it.
You just reminded me of something that I want you to come back to, and I will take a mental note for later. But um, you just reminded me that you, in addition to utilizing my services, took on many different layers of support. And I'll want you to lay out what some of those other things were, because it wasn't just me. You definitely had other things in the mix. And, this episode isn't about me trying to get people to work with me. This episode is about helping people understand all that's out there for them and the ways in which they can utilize that. So I'm going to bookmark that so we can come back to it. But in the meantime, I want to kind of take it back to the beginning, because you have a history of anxiety and depression, which many people do, who end up having depression, anxiety that troubles them during the antenatal or prenatal period, and as well postpartum. But I think it's always important that we kind of take a quick peek back at the origins of that, because it's really different for everybody. Would you mind sharing just a little bit about the early days of you understanding that you had anxiety and depression?
Absolutely. So my first major depressive episode that I can think back on was when I was in high school. I had always been kind of a shy and anxious kid before that, though, so it's kind of tough to say when it started. I've always had a lot of social anxiety, though I had more generalized anxiety later on, I think. But actually, depression was what I struggled more with for a long time, just kind of always lingering in the background. And about 7 years ago, I had another like really major depressive episode, which like I almost didn't survive through that. And that's also when I started to really develop anxiety as like clinical anxiety, as a major thing in addition. And then for a long time, anxiety was more what I would experience rather than depression. So heading into pregnancy and, knowing the statistics and knowing that I was much more at risk to have postpartum depression, of course, that's something I anticipated and worried about. And, having had this like really bad episode, some years ago, fresh in my mind, like I knew how bad it could get. And of course, back then it was easier because it was just me. And I didn't also have to worry about taking care of a newborn or any of that. By the way, I had zero experience with babies or children. I never babysat. I never held a baby. So like, I was like going in starting at level 0 here. Total newbie, like, and I do lots of research. I try to prepare as much as I can. I do all of the things, but nothing can really prepare you for that, until you're in it. Obviously, I wasn't, a baby person growing up. So yeah, there was a lot of, lack of confidence there. I tried to prepare as much as I could, but I also knew that once I had the baby, there wouldn't be any time to really do that because, I would be sleep deprived and, things were going to be so busy. So my pregnancy was very stressful in that way. I put a lot on myself to try to prepare. My husband was working really long hours too. And so it felt like a lot of it fell on me to just make sure we were ready and, and maybe things that would have been a little different too. But we recently, like a year prior, had moved away from the city where we used to live. And we didn't really have any friends in the new area. Plus, with the pandemic going on, like we hadn't really made any new friends or, had any social network nearby. Both of our parents, don't live nearby either. So we didn't have any family. And so, of course, that's another big thing, because if we had friends and family nearby, then it may have, been a little different. But I knew that we didn't. And so there was, that stressor as well. And my pregnancy was very physically very easy because for years I worried about how I would handle pregnancy too, since I had a lot of history with chronic pain and other medical stuff. But actually, like, all of that went really well. But the mental toll that it took on me was insane. And I had one friend who had prenatal depression and had mentioned it once. And even with all of my knowledge about mental health and such from my own years in therapy and whatever, I never knew that prenatal depression was a thing, which of course it makes sense, because you can have depression at any time, right? So I'm glad that I had that awareness at least. But yeah, I was definitely dealing with that. And I didn't know how to recognize it either because in the past I had recognized depression as more like a looming cloud that was just like underneath everything constantly. And this was more like a roller coaster. And so I wasn't sure if it was depression or if it was just pregnancy hormones, up and down. Because I would have a lot of silly up and downs too. I mean, it was just, how it is. So it was really hard to assess what was going on. And I'd been in therapy on and off, mostly off because, insurance doesn't cover it and whatnot. So I usually wait till I'm really in crisis to have that, unfortunately, because I'm a huge proponent of therapy and I would be in it all the time if I could. But yeah, so I think I found a therapist kind of late in my pregnancy, mostly as like well, my doctor recommended it too, but I agreed like it would be good to have one that I already had heading into labor and delivery and postpartum because I was going to need that support. And it was also just, it helped to navigate pregnancy a little bit as well. I was just so paranoid about everything. We put so much pressure on the person carrying the baby to, it's like you're a vessel and you can't do anything wrong and basically you read everything you put into your body is going to harm the baby somehow. And I also struggled with some like not eating disorder, but I think I have like disordered eating, issues. And so it was very hard for me to not be stressed all the time that I was pregnant and worried that I was doing something wrong and harming my baby. And still, like, I could not go through that again. It was really hard. And it was really hard on my relationship with my husband. Like, when I was pregnant, it was rough. It was not a good time. On the other hand, I did love being pregnant. I loved feeling pregnant. I loved what my body was doing. I loved how I felt. So yeah, there's just so many conflicting emotions about this time in my life, about all of this.
Well, that really explains the feeling, though, very concisely of the ups and downs that were unique to you in pregnancy. Because, on one hand, you were able to find moments of experiencing how magical it is, what your body is doing. But on the other hand, all the fear and all the hormones and all the other things that are absolutely legit and part of the equation would creep back up on you and rob you of that joy, right? So, wow.
Yeah, and I wonder if part of it was because I was too educated. It's hard to know. Like you say, it's good to be prepared, but sometimes that makes it worse because, I was already 36, 30, I just turned 36 when I got pregnant. I knew very well how common miscarriage was. I knew the risks. I knew all about genetic issues. I knew all the things that could go wrong. And my brain never let me forget that stuff. I mean, it was just always there. And it made it hard to enjoy it. Towards the end, it was easier because it was like, okay, we've gotten to this point. Like, the further along you get, it's like, okay, maybe I can relax a little. Although I also know everything that could go wrong in delivery. And like I had mentioned before, I try to prepare as much as possible, but there's only so much you can prepare. There's too many things that can go wrong. And I don't know. My husband was much more chill about this, and not as maybe aware of the realities. But as such, he was able to enjoy it a lot more because nothing bad happened. So it all went well. I had like a dream like labor and delivery too. And so it's just like, wow, that all went really well, and maybe I shouldn't have worried so much, but it's like I really didn't have much control over what my brain was doing at the time, and definitely not in postpartum.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you said that I think is really important to drive home is earlier on you said there's nothing that can prepare you, right? And then later on you mentioned wondering if you were over prepared. And I think that's where the type of work we did, as opposed to perhaps the other types of work that you may have done in other areas, is so critical. And again, whether it's a professional or it's a loved one that plays a similar role for people, part of finding that balance, I think, is being prepared for certain really common things in terms of the awareness that it can happen, understanding what it is, but not necessarily going down the rabbit hole of everything, because you never know which things you're going to get. So I'm distinctly remembering that while you were still pregnant, we went down some rabbit holes about your labor,
Yeah.
right? With the labor that you wanted. And then you had this, as you say, pretty easy pregnancy, wonderful birth, all of this stuff. And thank God you had those things, because had you not, those would have been other things that you had to deal with in retrospect. So I'm so thrilled that you didn't. But that's exactly my point. Someone else may, and this person exists out there, have had a hard pregnancy and or a hard delivery, but not end up dealing with postpartum depression or anxiety. And so you never know which set of cards you're going to get dealt. And so having your support on hand to deal with whatever it is that does come up is what's most important.
Absolutely. Although I wanted to just circle back because you said like, yeah, and I had an easy time with all of that. But, part of me also felt guilty about that with the postpartum feelings, because it was like, we didn't have any health problems with the baby. I had an easy time. I had the delivery that I wanted. Why am I struggling so much? Because I also knew that like traumatic birth can lead to postpartum, like all these other things. And it almost felt like, why am I struggling so much? Because I had it easier, and also I have a pretty easy baby, and I'm very grateful for that, because like I said, I had no experience with babies at all, and I had a really hard time becoming confident as a mom. So it's a good thing that we haven't had any like major medical problems with her or anything, just the normal newborn stuff, which is hard enough.
Oh yeah.
It's hard enough. But thank God, because, I have other friends who had lots of issues with their babies. I didn't have an easy time. Like, I'm the problem here. No one gets off easy. And you always struggle with something, whether it's pregnancy, the delivery, the baby, or mental health. Like, I feel like no one gets off scot-free here.
Nobody. Nobody. Okay, let's take it back a little bit. We now know that you had a fairly easy pregnancy, a nice birth, but what do you remember most about those first few days home?
I actually listened to some of our old Marco Polos because...
Oh, you did?
Yeah, because it's so
Wow.
crazy to hear myself those first few days. Like, I don't even recognize myself. And I remember thinking, like logically, like, I know this is going to be hard. I knew this is going to be hard. And I know that I'm supposed to be feeling overwhelmed and baby blues and all of that. But I still was like, I don't understand how people do this. Well, the other thing is the baby came like a week early, and my mom was supposed to come help. But because of her schedule, it ended up being 2 weeks before she could come. My husband had to go to work after those 2 weeks, so it was kind of dicey with like me getting help. But also I was just thinking like, it's too much for two people, especially when one of those people is recovering from childbirth. And, I didn't even have a C-section or anything. That's the other thing. It's like, gosh, how do people do this when they have C-sections? But I was physically struggling so much too. And it just felt impossible. And, we prepared a lot ahead of time too, in terms of logistics, where the baby would sleep and how we were going to set up the house. And none of that ended up working out. We had to completely like change things on the fly, because you just don't know. until you're in it, what's going to work? It's really hard to prepare. And, you know, my brain does not like this kind of thing. I like being prepared and having things work. And there's so much unknowns that come with that. And it was so hard. But also, like, I had a hard time sleeping. We tried to prioritize sleep. We planned to take shifts. We kind of needed to anyway because I was basically useless at taking care of the baby in the beginning. But I had a hard time sleeping anyway. Like, I would go to sleep and my brain would not go to sleep. Like, I couldn't sleep longer than 3 hour stretches. I think because my body knew I was supposed to be breastfeeding or whatever. And so I would just wake up constantly, even though I was trying to sleep. People would be trying to let me sleep, but I couldn't. And that was really rough.
Yeah.
Because then there would be like a day where I got a lot of sleep and it was just the whole world was brighter. Everything was better just because I had gotten sleep. So not being able to sleep, even when you're really trying to get enough sleep, was really, really hard. Well, and that was another thing that contributed. You know, I had breastfeeding struggles, and that was something that was really important to me. And I did a lot of preparation work for that as well. I saw lactation consultants ahead of time. I mean, I knew it was a challenge. I knew it wasn't going to come easily. So I really tried to prepare. And it just did not work out. And I had to give up really quickly on that. And that was really hard to grieve too. You know, and part of me always kind of wonders if that had gone easier, how would that have affected things? You know, or if I hadn't had the mental health challenges, how would that have affected it? Because basically, I knew what I needed to do to at least help try to solve the challenges we were having, but I couldn't do it because mentally I just could not handle it, you know?
Yeah. Well, what I remember about it is, besides the physical struggles of the act of breastfeeding that were real, you were having so much trouble sleeping, right? You came home
Yeah.
already sleep deprived, as almost everybody does from a hospital stay. I mean, it's just the way it is. You came home sleep deprived. Breastfeeding was not going well, so you were basically trying to figure it out 24/7. Then we would be trying to change gears and get you to get some sleep, but then you couldn't sleep, so we could never get ahead of that.
Yeah.
And it became clear very quickly to all of us, your husband, you, and me, that we needed to prioritize your mental health first. Like, it just leapt to the top of the list.
I actually have a little journal app where I kept track of, events and stuff
Wow.
as they happen because I have no short-term memory at all anymore. And definitely back then I didn't, and I wanted to remember how things had happened. But like basically we came home from the hospital on a Tuesday, and by Thursday that was like a crisis day already, and because I was meant to be pumping because we were having trouble latching. So I was meant to be pumping a lot to keep my supply up and all of that. And I just couldn't because all of my energy was to surviving mentally those days. And that Thursday, like I was on the phone with friends and stuff who were like talking me off the ledge is what it felt like. It was that kind of day. So that entire day we did no latching, we did no pumping. And it just felt like, yeah, I can't come back from this because like I dried up so quickly. And it's like by the time I could get a little more mentally stable, it's too late, which is really hard. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know how people do
Yeah.
it. Because, we had, the baby was very healthy and we didn't really have many issues with her, but yeah, she wouldn't latch. That was the thing that was hard. And mentally that was hard for me too, because it felt like she was rejecting me and, she would cry all the time and I wouldn't know how to help it. And so every time we would try, that wouldn't go well, and that would just send me down a spiral too.
Yeah.
And grieving the loss of that, of being able to breastfeed, was very hard for me too. Even though I knew very well that formula was fine and that lots of people have challenges breastfeeding. Like I was very educated on this, and ahead of time I told myself I wasn't going to give myself a hard time if it doesn't work out, that my mental health was a priority. I told myself all these things. So I wasn't like feeling guilty like about it, but I just felt like I had to grieve it. the
Yeah.
the path I
Yeah.
wanted, and the, relationship, or whatever, how I wanted it to be. I had to grieve that, and that made me really sad.
Yeah. Well, I think part of, it's funny, this is part of relationships of all kinds, and it's certainly part of parenthood and being a new parent, especially. I think we learn a special skill of how to hold two opposing thoughts as equal. And I find, anyway, for me, that one side of the equation tends to be a little more heady or intellectual, while the other side is a little more emotional. And they are both valid, but, they feel like they're competing. And in those early days of grieving the loss of something that didn't go the way you want or whatever it is, it's really just those two. It's like scales, the traditional image of, those balancing scales. And time kind of takes care of a piece of that, right? It never completely goes away. You
Yeah.
can always look back and add some more wonder, as you're probably doing right now,
Yeah.
in being brave enough to share your story. But yeah, I think, I think I know, you tell me, that your intellectual brain believes that you made the right choices.
Oh yeah. I mean,
Okay.
well, I feel like I didn't make the choice, though. I feel like my
Okay.
body,
Okay.
or I mean, like that was part of why it was hard to deal with, because it felt like the choice was made for me, because I was just trying to survive, and then my body quit, like.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was hard too. On the other hand, we're 8 months out now, and sometimes I just think, like, how, like, okay, yes, there are a lot of challenges with formula feeding too, like the shortage that we've had to deal with.
Yeah.
And, logistically, it's a challenge for if I didn't have to pack food every time we left the house. However, sometimes I just think, like, God, I didn't have to deal with all these other things, though, that I would have, and I would have had so much less autonomy if, I was tied to her that way, and just all these other things that, I don't know, make me wonder how people breastfeed at all. So I've definitely made peace with it in that way, because it's like, yeah, this definitely was the right move for our family. And I mean, she's thriving, she's in the 99th percentile for her height. And like, I
Wow.
mean, she's super healthy. So clearly, it was the right decision in the end. I do think back a lot, like, if certain things were different, like, what if we had decided to formula feed from the get-go? What if we had adopted her, so I wasn't going through all this physical stuff, in the early days? How would that have affected things? Because it's just so much. Like, you don't realize, like, to have to go through all this recovery and then also dealing with a newborn, and it's in the sleep deprivation. It's just, I don't know, it's just so much. It's too much. It's
It
really too
is.
much.
It's a miracle. It's a miracle sometimes that the human race has survived as long as it has. And look, this is cliche, and I should probably say this on every episode. This was obviously easier in a time of life where we lived close to our whole extended families in villages. It does take a
Yeah.
village. And in a village situation, we let the new parent get a ton of rest, and we wait on that person hand and foot. We do all of these wonderful things for them. And so it's amazing that we're surviving modern society is really
Well, and
really
it
what I think
feels
about
like
this.
people know this, and yet I don't know. It's really hard to talk to people who haven't had kids. They understand it on some level, but not like on the, like, how hard it really is, and for how long, and just, it's just really hard to understand until you're in it. And that's why I was really grateful. Like, so the second week after she was born, like, and I had the night shift while my husband would sleep, and I had, like, every night scheduled calls with friends who were parents, and most of them had been, like, kind of new parents too, because a lot of friends had babies, like, right before me. And yeah, it was just so good to talk to someone who, like, really understood it, like, really got it, how hard it is, and also to give some hope that it gets better. Because yeah, it's not talked about enough. And even though, like, I was very educated with all this stuff, I, follow a lot of postpartum and pregnancy, accounts and stuff. So it's like, I know it wasn't like it was a total shock to me, but still in like my personal life, as far as like close friends and stuff, it's not talked about enough, you know?
Yeah. Well, you're here
Yeah.
helping change
Yeah.
that because I think podcasts are such a huge player in this discussion because it's something people can do privately and hear somebody's personal story and come out of that just simply having listened to an episode, not feeling alone or feeling like their experience is unique. I remember telling you often, despite your struggles that were very real and very intense, that there was nothing that you were saying that other people who came before you hadn't said. You were experiencing many things in your own unique way at your own level of intensity, for sure, which is why sometimes, as I said when I introduced you, that I did worry whether or not I could be a really helpful part of your team. And looking back, I'm so grateful that I didn't give up on you or what we were doing. But I did worry because there was an intensity to yours that I
Yeah.
hadn't experienced many times. But I had to remind myself of my role and all the resources that you did have in place and continue to throw additional resources and tips your way, which is why I say you were that's what makes you so unique to me, is that somebody who was experiencing things as intensely as you were, I would imagine would be much more paralyzed. And you were never actually, at least from where I sit, paralyzed. You had this incredible way of hearing me, and in the moment I would think, she thinks I'm absolutely nuts that I just made whatever suggestion I made. She's so not into it. And then you would come back to me hours or the next day with a Marco Polo or a text or whatever and tell me that you did it. And that most things, you understood where I was coming from with that. One thing that comes to mind that I just think is so adorable to picture, I wonder if you know what I'm going to say already. No?
No.
Is when you were getting a little bit further postpartum and you were starting to express concerns about like, how do I go back to my professional life? And I was like, you were starting to feel a little anxious about having not touched your instruments.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I told you to play your violin to your baby, that you needed to let your baby in on that piece of who you are and that it would be profound for your baby. And it took you a little while, but you finally did it. And the other thing I remember that just came on the heels of that is, in my gut, I knew that you were someone who would enjoy being a mother as soon as your baby could show you that they appreciated you by smiling and things like that. And both of those things worked out really well. And I started to see a lot of corner turning once we got into that zone.
But a lot of people say that, you appreciate it more when the baby smiles or whatever. And I always just thought it was like, oh, whatever. Because, when she was born, she was really cute. And it did seem like she would react to us. Like she'd make funny faces and other things. And so I was like, I don't know, she's plenty interactive already. But yeah, I didn't really realize like how much that would shift when she started smiling. Like, oh my gosh, it's like the whole world like shifts. But also it was because in the beginning, I felt very much like she didn't know me from Adam. Like I wasn't mom. Like I was just some other person who was taking care of her, and probably the person in our household who was taking care of her the least. Because, my husband was really doing the bulk of it at first and really bonding with her. And then my mom came and kind of took over, and my mom was like baby whisperer and amazing with her, and I needed that, but it also made me feel like she doesn't even know who I am. She doesn't know that I'm mom. We're not even breastfeeding. Like I'm not special. And so yeah, it took a while for me to actually feel like we had that kind of bond, that she actually like started to prefer me, or at least like recognize who I am. And that came more when like my mom left and like it was just us, I think, and we had some more time together, just us. But
those were very interesting moments actually, when there were periods of time between when your husband went back to work, when your mom couldn't come at one point, when she thought she was going to, all that stuff. We had to try to gear you up to be confident, safe, and minimally content to be alone with the baby. And you always did a little better than you expected to do. So a lot of the anxiety and worry is preemptive. And then the reality of the situation most times was way better. Of course, every parent and baby have their bad days where the baby's particularly fussy or whatever, and you would have a couple times where you were like, I couldn't nap at all and I desperately needed to nap, and you would have another downturn, but many of those days were better than you thought they would be. And I think that's a really interesting point for people to hear, is a lot of anxiety and depression, especially in the perinatal period, is worrying about what ifs.
Yeah.
And not what's actually happening in the moment. So I think that's where the reprieve comes in, I guess.
It's true. And I was going to say my biggest fear with taking care of the baby by myself was that I would fall asleep while holding her or something, was that I would dangerously fall asleep from lack of sleep. That was definitely my biggest fear. And that's why I was so obsessed with like trying to get sleep. And also that I wouldn't be getting enough sleep. And so I would do something like, I wouldn't be in the right mind and do something dangerous by, you know what I mean? Like, because it really messes with you. And I'm a person who would typically get like 9 hours of sleep before this. So it was really hard for me to adjust to that. But thankfully that never happened. I mean, there were some really rough days, but yeah, like that never happened. And I never like felt like I was actually going to fall asleep. There was always someone around enough, or I was able to like get enough of a break.
Have you encountered confusion and anxiety when it comes to feeding your baby? Whether you are in the prenatal stage or are already feeding your baby, I would love to partner with you so that you feel at ease about the feeding choices you make for your baby. My name is Lo Nigrosh. As an internationally board certified lactation consultant, I can combine my expertise of hormones, milk supply, and infant and parent physiology with your expertise of your family situation to help you feel more joy and less frustration while feeding your baby. You can find all my information at my website at www.quabbinbirthservices.com.
Hey everyone, it's me, Tanya, your host here at the Mother Wit podcast. You know I sometimes invite my clients on the show to talk about their birth stories and postpartum experiences, but I want to tell you a little bit more about what those clients and I actually do together. I started Mother Wit to help people in the perinatal period achieve their health and wellness goals. That means whether you're hoping to conceive and struggling with high blood pressure or high blood sugar, or you're having trouble managing anxiety or depression in the postpartum period, or maybe you just need support and advocacy between prenatal or postpartum visits, I can help. Get a discount on your first consultation with me at motherwitmaternity.com using the code FIRSTCONSULT 10% off. That's 10% symbol, all one word. I'm looking forward to working with you and maybe having you on the show too.
We hope you're enjoying the Mother Wit podcast. If you are, please rate us and leave a review in iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to your podcast. Thanks so much. Now, back to the show.
I did a lot of preparation for labor, right? Because I wanted a natural, like, medication-free childbirth, so I did a lot of preparation for that. And one of the things that really got me through was thinking, instead of saying, like, I can't do this, to say, I am doing this, like, I am doing this right now. And that really helped to get me through labor. And at some point, I realized that that also helped me get through motherhood, because I would constantly think, I can't do this. Like, you know, she'd be crying and I couldn't soothe her or something. And I can't do this. I can't do this. And then I would think, I am doing this like 1 hour at a time. Like, I am changing her diaper right now, and I am giving her the bottle, and like, you know, you try not to think too far ahead and just getting by day. And then all of a sudden, 2 months later, it was like things really started to turn for the better at that point. I feel like that's when I started to get on the upswing. 2 months in, started to feel a little better. But I don't think we've mentioned yet so far that I was on Zoloft after a week, and that definitely made a huge difference.
I totally was about to go there in that moment. I thought the same thought you did, because it made me say, you know, we can never know. Of course, the sample size of one is just that way. We can never really know what it would have been like with or without. But the vast majority of my clients who do start medications do feel that the medications work. I mean, and that's just wonderful. That to me was the day that I remember being with you in crisis.
Yeah. And I remember I just woke up and I was like in crisis. Because that was another thing that was, the mornings were the worst for me. Well, late at night was also bad when I had the night shift, but I would wake up and instantly have this feeling of dread, like, oh, I have to go through another day and I don't know how that day is going to turn out and I have to keep doing this, So the mornings were always really rough. And yeah, I woke up and I just got into this, crisis, spiral. I don't remember exactly what was said or if you were the one who brought up medication, but I instantly was like, yes.
I did bring it up. And the reason I remember that is because, I also remember the day I met you when we did our initial free consult to see if we were a good fit. And I remember that day feeling the depths of your depression at that time. I felt that more than I felt the anxiety initially when I met you. And I remember just feeling a little like you might be somebody who would really benefit from medication during pregnancy, but that you did not want to do that. And that was okay. I was happy to support you in whatever way you wanted to be supported. But the reason I remember this is because deep down I thought, I think she's going to need medication postpartum unless the fog lifts, which is such a rare thing to do in those early days.
Yeah, and I had never taken medication before for depression in the past, and I'm not opposed to it. I've always been able to manage without, and I don't know, I'm a musician, I'm an artist, so it's like, it feels a little like, I don't know if I want something messing with that or to be dependent on something. But in this case, it was more like how it would affect the baby. And like I said, I was just so paranoid about literally anything I was doing affecting the baby. And since it was also a lot of roller coaster up and downs, that made me think that I could weather it, because it wasn't just like a constant thing. And because I would have these like really crisis moments, but then I'd have all these days when I would be fine. It's like by the time I would think like, oh, I wish I could talk to my therapist today. But then by the time the appointment rolled around, it was like, I'm okay. So it makes it hard to like jump on the medication bandwagon when you're experiencing that because, the fog lifts temporarily and you're like, okay, why was I overreacting? Maybe it's just like the pregnancy ups and downs. So that was rough. And I did think recently when I was, thinking about when we were talking about me coming on here, I was wondering to myself, like, what would have been how would it have been different if I had started the medication prior to delivery? Like, how would that have affected things? I don't know.
Yeah, we can't know.
Yeah.
We can't know.
Or no, I was thinking like maybe with what I know now, would I have made a different choice, Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I hear you. Well, what I remember about the day that you decided to start medication was that you were in crisis. It was one of those days where you woke up with that feeling of dread. It was particularly profound. And I think I literally just said, I think it might be time to consider medication. And you just said, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, we did not have to talk about it. You were ready. And that spoke to me to the depths of where you were at.
Well, because I almost felt like I was ready to be checked in somewhere because it was that bad. Like, I just could not do this. And I needed to go somewhere where I wasn't going to do this. Like, I was going to run away or something because I didn't see a way out. And this was a week out. I still had to go through another week before my mom was going to come. And that was also really bad, too, because it's like I was almost like pleading with her over the phone every day to see if she could come early. And like, it was so bad. And everyone was worried about me.
So tell us a little bit about what the timeline was like in terms of you starting to feel like the medication was affecting you positively. Because I think a lot of people wonder what that journey is like, and it is different for everyone, but I think people need to hear what it's like for different people.
Even just starting the medication helped because I knew I was doing something about it. Like, and sometimes when you feel like more in control, that helps because I can hang on to that. Like, okay, it's going to get better because I'm taking the medication and that's going to help. I wrote in my notes week 4 mentally doing much better. But I don't know exactly what that means.
Well, look, the word standalone, that's 3 weeks later. So even if we don't have a ton of information, 3 weeks later, you said, I'm mentally doing much better.
Yeah, and the previous week I wrote feeling more like everything is going to be okay. That was when my mom got here. Because at least when my mom was here, I knew,
Yep.
like, even if I'm a mess, the baby would be taken care of. Like, there was a huge relief when she got here because I knew she would just take over and nothing bad was going to happen, basically. Like, there was going to be no neglect or, like, at least the baby would be okay and I would be taken care of, So there was some relief with that.
What I think I remember about the medication kicking in, and of course, because your mom came a week later, it gets a little muddy in terms of understanding, like, is it because of this?
Yeah.
Is it because of that? Is it both? Blah, blah, blah. But what I think we can attribute somewhat to you starting the medications was your ability to sleep steadily improved.
Yeah.
That was huge. And I don't know if that was because your mom was there or the medication, but it felt to me like it was an effect of the medication. And the highs and lows really leveled out slowly over time.
Well, and also, also that week I wrote first enjoyable tummy time. Like, she was interacting more.
What week was that?
When she was 3 weeks. So as she was doing more things and like being, having more fun, because that's the other thing, you see all this stuff on Instagram and whatever, and you imagine what life is going to be like with the baby. And like, I got all these educational toys and I set up her nursery just so, because I'm imagining all the activities we're going to do together. And in the beginning, you can't really do any of that. There's really nothing, they don't do anything. And so that can be a little bit frustrating too, because I'm not like the mom I want to be yet, like how I imagined it. And as she was able to interact a little more, it feels a little more like, okay, yeah, I'm doing the thing and it's going well. And it also kind of goes hand in hand with the baby's development, But yeah, there was one day when she like actually recognized me. And that was like, oh, wow. Like, okay, that meant something, because usually my mom would take care of her overnight and I would come in the morning and see them, and my mom would be holding and be like, oh, look, mommy's here. And like, she would say something like as if it was in the baby's voice, like the baby was excited to see me, which clearly she wasn't. She was just like sitting there. But then eventually it did seem like that,
Deep down, you knew that you deserved and could have happiness. And that's why you kept fighting. Like, you didn't just throw in the towel and say, I'm destined to be depressed or anxious. And you know that you have this in you and you will likely have it in you forever. But you knew how important it was to seek the tools needed to enjoy your baby and your family. And you prioritized that. And you did such a good job at doing that. And by the time we were wrapping up around 12 weeks, you had, I'm not saying it was perfect, and I would love you to provide a little update from about 12 weeks to now, which is about 4 months since we spoke last. But it was a world of difference. Would you agree?
Yeah. That's why I said, like, at 2 months, things started to turn around. And then, like, yeah, by 3 months, it had really improved a lot. I feel like because I'd had these, like, major depressive episodes in the past, especially the one that was, like 7 years ago, I knew I could get back from it. Like, I had gotten back before, and this time I had a lot more motivation because unlike before, I feel like I actually got better a lot faster because like 2 months I was already starting to come out of it, and 3 months I was like, okay, things are a little bit more back to normal. Whereas before it was months and months and months of me just being in like a pit of despair and going to therapy every week but I had to get better quickly for my child, because I also knew that like not bonding with her or not paying attention to her or anything else that I might be doing because I just can't get it together was going to be hurting her. And we didn't have time. That's also why I was quick to jump on the medication, because it's like I knew we did not have time for me to just not be okay. And I remember my husband was also a little like iffy about that. And it was good that we had you to provide like a good frame of reference because, you said my experience was common, but he was reluctant for me to go on the antidepressants because he thought, well, it's only been a week, there's the baby blues and all that, and we needed you to say like, yeah, she's really suffering. I work with a lot of people and this is not normal. Like to have that frame of reference was really important because it can be hard to know.
It can be hard for me to know. And that's, to go back to a point I wanted to make earlier when we talked about sleep. Everybody needs sleep. Everybody needs an emphasis on sleep. But for me as a clinician, looking at different people, not having a crystal ball and not knowing who's going to get depressed and who's not, I need to help people sort out sleep because it provides me with so much information. A little like how you can even say, those times I did get some sleep, I felt so much better. So everyone across the board will say something like that. But people who are being deeply affected by the lack of sleep, but otherwise aren't dealing with a mood disorder or are only dealing with baby blues, the difference is so much more dramatic. And it sticks with them because they kind of learn the skill and we get into a groove and things start to smooth out as opposed to that up and down roller coaster. So that's a huge difference. And I think it's so critical that people think about all the factors that are involved and come up with a game plan for how to not just poo-poo it and keep pushing it off, because I see that too. I've had many clients never go on meds who maybe should have, and I've had many clients not go on meds till more like 8 weeks, and they're suffering, and they're suffering for much longer because they're resistant, and that's okay, right? Again, everyone has their own timeline, and I'm here to support everyone. But as an outsider, you kind of get this idea of the degree of suffering that you're watching somebody endure.
Yeah. I know whenever I see people now talk about not wanting to go on meds, and I'm just like, in my head, I'm just like, just go on the meds. It helps so much. And you need that because, I don't know, maybe it's a blessing that I had this previous experience because at least it's like I know my body, I know my mind, and I knew this was not okay. I knew this was beyond my depth, my ability to come back from it on my own without some more intervention. Like I could tell that, because it wasn't just that I was sleep deprived, obviously. It was that I couldn't bond with her. I felt like she would be better off without me. There were so many times where I just thought, like, I can't do this anymore. Like I just can't. I don't see a way out. Or that, like, I made this huge mistake and there's no coming back from this and I'm never going to figure it out. There's just all these thoughts, these really dark thoughts too, and that is different, and I knew that can be normal, not normal, but like it wasn't a fault of me. Like it wasn't like I'm not a terrible person for having these thoughts. Like I knew like that this is what happens, but that didn't make it any easier to not have these thoughts anyway. Especially when I felt like I didn't know how to be a good mom because I didn't know how to deal with babies, and my husband was so good with her and my mom was so good with her, and I was just like, every time my mom would leave to like go get food or something, she would just have this meltdown and I couldn't. It's like, why does this always happen with me? And I would just lose it because it just felt like I would never learn or figure it out.
So what's it like now? I mean, in the 4 months since we last connected, how do you feel about motherhood at this point?
It's going well now. I mean, it's not easy, of course, but I feel like even when I struggle now, it feels more like, well, but everyone is this level of, struggling with motherhood. Although, I mean, sometimes it gets a little low. I'm still on the Zoloft and I want to continue on it until at least I have some more things sorted out with childcare and such, some more support before I consider weaning off of it. But like, I mean, it's helped so much, and it's just amazing to see her grow. And yeah, I feel competent, like I'm doing a good job, at least as much as anyone can feel like that as a mother.
Are you back to working?
Not really. I mean, I mostly work from home anyway, so it's flexible. I've done a few like music gigs or projects from home, but I haven't really been able to sort out childcare yet, which is a bummer, but it's the daycares are all full or she's too young for them, and it's been hard to find babysitters who are available to just kind of get into that, but yeah, that's the next thing I really have to be working on, obviously, because that is going to help so much just to feel like myself again in that way.
You mentioned before you started meds a fear of the medication sort of blunting your creativity, things like that. Can you speak to the reality of the situation, or, I don't know if you've engaged in enough creativity to feel like you've assessed that, but
it's not. So it's interesting. I've talked with the psychiatrist that I check in with every month about this too, because we've adjusted my dosage quite a few times. And that was always a concern. It doesn't blunt my creativity. It's more like I used to always have really big feelings and be a very emotional person. And that's also part of, being a musician and all, right? I can access that very easily, which also probably, it's like the straight highway to depression as well. These things are all interconnected. But like, I'll watch a movie or something and I'm an easy cry, like it's really easy for me to have cathartic crying and stuff like that too, in addition to the depressive type of crying, but just like happy cry or other emotions, happy emotions. And when I was pregnant, obviously that was like off the charts, like, but after I went on Zoloft, I noticed that, of course it was taming the lows, but I also it's like I couldn't seem to access that anymore. Like I would only cry if I was like really upset or something, but not like happy tears, or I would feel a little dead inside, in terms of like happier emotions sometimes. But that has definitely come around. And maybe I also went back a dose or so.
So you not only went up dose, you've gone back down, is what you're saying. I see.
Yeah, we went up for a while and then went back down a little because that worried me. I didn't like that, that feeling.
Yeah.
Where it was like I would feel intellectually happy, but not emotionally in the same way that I'm accustomed to feeling it as a person who feels big feelings, if that makes sense. It's really hard to explain.
No, I hear you, because what the thing I'm thinking about as you say it is, obviously it feels, I'm sure even for our listeners, but I don't want to sugarcoat anything, so I'm glad that you said it. When you said, I felt a little dead inside, I had a moment of being like, oh, that's going to scare people away from medication. And it might, but this is about an honest conversation, and that's fine. But what I wonder is if it's not as much dead inside as much as it is just simply drawing the comparison of what you used to access in terms of highs and lows, and it being very different.
Yeah. I realized that after I said that. I was like, oh, I shouldn't have maybe put it that way.
I am not cutting that. I think it's very real and honest, and I'm glad you said it and that we're unpacking it.
I just remember that phrase because I said it in therapy because, I was like, oh, yeah, well, of course I love her and I want what's best for her, but I feel dead inside. Like, it was just like, because it's weird to understand, like, to also like, because in therapy it's also like unpacking like that I love my baby even though I was going through all this stuff, like that it's hard because it's hard to feel like I loved her when I was having all these scary thoughts about motherhood and not bonding, and she had to like kind of point out to me like that these actions were proof that I loved her even though I didn't feel the love in the way that I expected to, you know what I mean? So it's kind of a little bit like that, like, love is showing up and all of that. Not necessarily like the ooey gooey, like feeling warm inside, I guess is what I mean, is feels a little bit like I'm missing, but that is coming back. I don't still feel that way. It's just, it's been a little bit of a trade-off for a while, but it's definitely coming back over time. And, but that's also why I don't want to go up on my dose if I don't have to, because there was some concern that maybe I should, but I definitely don't want to lose that progress that I've made there.
And we want to stay on the lowest effective dose. And it makes sense that what happened for you was like you passed a certain threshold that was not okay, so you came back down, and you have found your sweet spot.
Well, and the other thing too, I asked because I was like, what is the goal here? because are we trying to get me to the baseline that I was before all of this? Because I was always a bit tumultuous with my emotions and stuff. So I don't think it's realistic to think that that's just going to completely subside.
Right.
I'm still an emotional person. So I just want to make sure that I'm functioning enough that, the bad doesn't outweigh the good or whatever. So like, even though I said that about the meds, like obviously I'm still on them and I still, want to be on them because it's making, it helped me be a better mother. And that's more important to me than being able to cry at movies or whatever right now. But yeah, it's just interesting because I think everyone has a different experience with it though, and how it makes them feel.
And that's why I collect stories, and that's
Yeah.
why there's not just one episode of someone's journey through a mental health situation that interfaces with the perinatal period, because there are so many unique versions, and I just want people to hear one of those versions that speaks to them. And it's very likely that as people listen, they hear one or two or three things from this episode and one or two or three from this other one and put that all together, and suddenly this is really resonating. As we move towards wrapping up, I would love it if we come full circle back to that very first thing you said that we would table, which was, can you just tell people what your layers of support were? Because I don't remember what they all were. I just remember that I'm not even sure if at the beginning you ever like kind of cohesively told me, but every so often you would reference something and I would go, oh, she's doing that too? Wow, she's doing that too? So just tell us what some of those things were and what you think about each of them, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Yeah, so I started with therapy, I guess, finding a therapist. I didn't find a psychiatrist, like it was just a regular therapist. I ended up having to have a psychiatrist person later to manage the medication. And actually that was really helpful as well, because the way they talked through everything was different than the way the therapist would. And it was very helpful. And it's still helpful because I still see them every month. But, it was, well, I had my mom. The original plan was for her to come for 2 weeks. She ended up staying for like 6 weeks and then she would take a week off and come back. Like, so she was in and out for quite a while, to help, but we really needed that. I needed that. So, I
feel like you had some sort of a peer support group thing.
Oh,
that was virtual.
That's right. It was like a virtual doula class group.
That's right. That's right.
And I thought that was nice because, being virtual, it was easier for me. And it was also pregnancy, like childbirth education and stuff. Every week we would meet. It was all people in the same, gestation
Around
or
your
whatever.
same
Yeah,
due date.
as me. And so that was really helpful. And then, but mostly I wanted it for postpartum support because I figured that was what I really needed. And the group ended up kind of like shifting or disbanding around that time anyway. It wasn't as helpful as it was still helpful. Like, I feel like just having lots of avenues is helpful because you can only, sometimes like one therapy session a week isn't enough. So, and you're just having multiple people to talk to or, points of view and all of that. So yeah, I did have that. And we had a meal train. We didn't have a traditional meal train because no one was local, although a few friends did bring us like lasagna. But we had like a DoorDash meal train, and that was so helpful because I was not in any frame of mind to be worrying about food at all. So like having the DoorDash like was such a mental load like off of my minds. Like, but having you is like probably the biggest one because it's good to have different kinds of support because each one brings like something different to the table, Like, even while I was still pregnant, we talked through a lot of pregnancy and delivery stuff. I was making all these debates about if I should have an induction or not. And, like, that was just really helpful to have that, like, really knowledgeable perspective because you don't get that from an OBGYN. My team there was great, but, it's just how it is in this country. And it was just really good to have someone that I could just always bounce ideas or questions off of, and like especially in postpartum because it was like even though I had these friends that I would call up on. That was another source of support, I guess. But, you can only do that so much before you feel like you're dumping on your friends and not all of them were qualified to help me. If they hadn't been through postpartum depression, like they'd say like, oh, it gets better when this and this and this. And it's like, maybe for you, like, because you are only dealing with this, but I'm also dealing with this. And of course, I would be afraid to say some things to them that I wouldn't be afraid to say to you, like, or even, to say to my mom or my husband. Or the work you and I did together was like a lot of validating that I needed, but also tough love when I needed it. And I couldn't get that from anyone else, not like effective tough love. But it just blows my mind to think about how much support I put in place for myself. And I still had such a hard time, Like, I really prepared for this, but part of me thought maybe like how pregnancy was easier for me than I expected, and how the, labor was easier than expected, that maybe I was doing all this preparing and it wasn't actually going to be so bad, or at least because I prepared, it wouldn't be so bad. And it still was so bad. So.
And what you're really saying is, I called in the troops on this one area. We can look back and say, all that work I did for pregnancy and birth, okay, that was quote unquote, wrong word, but wasted. But you couldn't know. And at the end of the day, everything you put into place for postpartum, you needed.
I needed it.
Yeah, you needed it, and possibly more, but you called in the troops, you utilized everyone and everything to its fullest, and you did come out on the other side. And I am so proud of you, and I am so grateful to you for being willing to speak so openly and candidly and honestly about your experience. From the moment we wrapped up, in the back of my mind, I knew that one day I would call on you and ask you if you were willing to speak. And I didn't know what you would say. And I'm so grateful that you have given us this time today. So your big message, is it the case that your big message is prepare for postpartum?
Yeah. Because, most people are impressed when I say I didn't have an epidural or whatever, but it's like, yes, okay, I'm really surprised that I did that too, but like, that's only one day and I got through it. But postpartum is so much harder. Like, it's lots of pain over and over in different ways.
It's a very different kind of pain. And people have such a hard time changing gears and seeing a part of their future that we only want to imagine being beautiful and full of love. Again, akin to marriage. We want to assume marriage is just going to be this lovely, lovely, lovely bed of roses. And it's hard. And so is having a baby. And that's why you did the work you did.
Yeah, it's hard having your entire, like, the way you are as a person shift, the way you view yourself. Yeah, and that part is still I'm navigating. A lot. It's still a lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Absolutely,
Patti.
yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Mother Wit podcast. If any of the issues we discussed today resonate with you or your experience, I'd love to hear from you. Leave me a voicemail at 917-310-0573, or better yet, email me a voice memo at tanya@motherwitmaternity.com. I really want to hear what worked for you, what didn't work, what support you'd wished you had, how you got through the tough times, how you advocated for yourself, or especially any tips you want to share with our listeners. I want to hear all of it. And if you'd really like to work together, you can get a discount on your first consultation with me at motherwitmaternity.com using the code FIRSTCONSULT 10% off. That's 10% symbol, all one word. Okay, that's all. It's wonderful being in community with you all. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.
And remember, listeners, nothing we discuss on this show should ever be considered medical advice. Please speak to your local provider about anything that comes up in this show that resonates with you and your needs and your health care.